Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
But let me make a distinction to start with then. We can talk about nonviolent tactics that are designed to sort of achieve particular political ends.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Sister Pat Schnapp. Father Bacik and Sister Schnapp will discuss civil disobedience, cultivating a nonviolent spirit. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Pat, I'd like to talk a little bit about nonviolence, and I hope we're able to do this without getting into a shouting match over the topic. I think you and I have certain disagreements about nonviolence, but perhaps we can talk about it in a civil way and try to figure out where we agree and where we do not agree. Do you want to start out by giving me a sense of what you mean by nonviolence?
Well, let's see. Probably not, but let's see if I can drum up a... I suppose by nonviolence I mean repressing rage, approaching with a peaceful heart, approaching without a sense of vengeance a person or institution or even indeed the government over an issue about which I have some disagreement. And quite frankly, I realize I have a problem. I have a problem.
Okay, well, I mean, we can get to that. I'm not sure we want to do that on the air, but we can get to that as we go along. But let me make a distinction to start with then. We can talk about nonviolent tactics that are designed to sort of achieve particular political ends. So we think of Martin Luther King used nonviolent tactics in the civil rights movement to try to change the Jim Crow laws in the South, and was eventually successful in doing so. So there, nonviolence is a tactic. It's a way of persuading people, of raising consciousness, and of trying to get people to see things in a new way. The way you began to define nonviolence seems to me to be more a matter of the heart, an internal matter. So we could talk maybe about a nonviolent spirit. So let's, in order for the sake of discussion, why don't we stay with the spiritual side of it, the nonviolent spirit, and what that would be like, and how we might create that, and what sort of obstacles we would find with that, and maybe what its long-range effectiveness might be. So I got out of what you said so far that that one would try to control one's angers, that one would have a forgiving sort of attitude, I suppose, that one would come at others and deal with others in a non-coercive way. I don't know if that's a fair way of saying it or not, but maybe we could stick with it. Let's stay with the anger thing just for a moment, because I would say this: if we're going to be nonviolent in spirit, we probably have to learn some way to deal with our angers.
That's right. That's right. And I sense in myself, as one who has been in numerous demonstrations, that it's often rage at some policy that gets me to the demonstration, and that while I am advocating perhaps peace in Central America or de-escalation of the arms race, that I'm often doing it with an enormous amount of rage in my heart, and it's often reflected in my language about persons in Washington who I feel are responsible for the policies. And I guess I'm recognizing that there is a certain inconsistency in all of this, and all of us, in fact, who I guess struggle with the tension between being aroused by anger to take action, and yet speaking in that action of peace, but not always with a peaceful heart.
Well, I sense the tension in what you're saying there, and it takes me back to something that Gandhi talked about and so on. That is the importance of purifying the heart, and I took it to be a process, this purification, that probably a recognition that it would be strong negative feelings that would bring one to the protest to begin with, or would be, that's the leverage or the motivating force that really is involved in all of this. So that I think that I sense the tension in what you're saying. In other words, anger brings you to the peace rally, because you're angry about the policies or angry at the people in Washington who make them. But then when you're there, you don't want to be shouting obscenities at people standing nearby, or
right.
yelling at them, who don't agree with you. In other words, that would undercut your whole thing. So maybe one way of thinking about it is that the nonviolent spirit would require a certain consistency, or at least require that we would be trying to move in that direction. My sense is that the tension you describe, it can't be eradicated, but only managed. That there's always people who feel passionate about issues, passionate enough to get involved and be trying to change governmental policies and so on, are going to have to be motivated by strong negative feelings. It doesn't seem to me very likely that you're going to overcome them. My sense would be to try to get it closer together in a way, get the anger so it works for you. Again, we've got the example of Jesus in sort of a holy rage, a righteous anger, as we say, where he was able to mobilize that passion in order to, an example of the throwing the money changers out of the temple, for example, to do something constructive with his anger.
To go from the sublime to the ridiculous, when I can get a little bit detached and get a little distance on all of this, I sort of chuckle at a cartoon that I read maybe 35 years ago. It was a Pogo cartoon, and in it Pogo, who was also against the arms race even then, said something to the effect of this: "If I were in power, I know what I would do to those who live by the sword. I'd take that bomb and I'd shove peace right down their bloodthirsty throats." And I sometimes laugh and say, is this what I am trying to do? Has my rage been let go to the point where I am no longer respectful of the dignity of the persons whose policies I don't agree with? And I think more and more I'm coming to recognize that I've got a rather major problem that I have to get hold of here.
Well, your use of humor there intrigues me, because it seems one of the functions of humor is to provide some sort of perspective in life. It keeps us from taking ourselves with ultimate seriousness, and allows us to see the incongruities that are in life. And,
That's right.
And so that maybe humor lightens it a bit. I mean, that would seem to me to be a healthy way maybe of trying to move towards this greater consistency that we're talking about. Pat, did you want to comment on that? Or
No, I agree with you, and I think maybe what we need in society today is more humor, as a matter of fact. More Art Buchwalds and Dave Barrys and people who
and H.L. Mencken.
That's right. That's right. Who can allow us to see things in a different perspective and laugh at, as you said, our own incongruities and inconsistencies.
What about the idea of forgiveness? I think you put that into the mix as well, in looking for this nonviolent spirit. There would have to be a willingness to forgive, an ability to allow people to begin over, and so on. Otherwise, all of that could fester and grab hold of one and really poison one's system, I think. It's hard to imagine a nonviolent spirit who would be unable to forgive. Where would you go with that? I mean, it seems like your system would always be in danger of being poisoned in one way or another.
I agree to the importance of forgiveness. Perhaps the difficulty, particularly when we're talking, when I'm thinking of myself as somewhat politically involved, is that it's easier to think of forgiving someone for something he or she did in the past that's over, that he or she is no longer doing. It's more difficult when what I am called upon to forgive is a continuing policy or stance or a series of what certainly seem to me to be distortions, not to say lies, that are perpetuated and that are ongoing to the great harm and even destruction of human life.
It would seem in order to deal effectively with that, that one would need the sense that there was an outlet, or that there was a way of going about it. For example, simply to raise people's consciousness on social questions, on poverty and hunger, problems of war and peace and so on, and then to leave it go really is to do a disservice for people, because then it's inside percolating and perhaps festering and issuing in this sort of poisonous climate that surrounds one. And I think that maybe what one would need is an outlet. For example, I mean, if you are terribly upset with the armament policies of the current administration, then you'd almost need something to say, I've got a lever to deal with that. Maybe I'm going to strengthen Congress, or try to get a new member of the House of Representatives elected, so these very close votes on weapons could be turned around. That begins to sound possible in a way,
That's right.
And then you can take that energy maybe that is so directed negatively at the policymakers and say, maybe I can use this to turn it around. I use that example of the House of Representatives because I often think that there's a closeness to the people, and they're reelected periodically and every 2 years, and there seems to be a way to get at it, and the votes in the House are so close on the peace and war questions.
That's right.
That you begin to feel like, yes, I could make a difference. But that's just an example. My generalized point is that when we have rage over something and deep anger and passion, negative feelings, that there has to be some outlet, some way of that we think we can redress or make a contribution or do something worthwhile. That becomes a positive way of using this energy.
I agree. In fact, probably your next book ought to be The Uses of Anger.
Well, considering how big a problem anger is in our society and how repressed anger causes so much depression,
That's right.
We all ought to figure out how to deal better with our anger.
With our anger. And so I totally agree that anger represents an energy which can be channeled to bring about a change against that which I am enraged about. At the same time, I think there's the more personal issue of can I let go of my hostility, my ill will even against the person or persons that I feel are responsible. This gets a little bit more difficult, and not instead, sort of delight in thinking of their being brought down low, not rather actively like to see them publicly embarrassed or whatever.
Let me make a test case on that.
Okay.
And I've tested this on you before, and I know your reactions. And that is that how liberals felt when Reagan was able to make the arms treaty with the Soviets. Now, I mean, it seems to me that people who are acting simply out of the hostility kind of mode that you were talking about would end up being mad. And even though it moved us in a direction in which they wanted to go, but that they would be angry, so
Yes.
hostile,
Yes.
and say, I don't want Reagan to have the glory of that, or it wasn't his policies that brought us to this, or this shouldn't work, or this undercuts
This all
my
happened
whole...
in spite of his own
Yeah,
ideology.
right, yeah, yeah. Whereas, I mean, it seems to me a test for a broader attitude would be something like this. Well, to put aside how we got there and say, hey, I'm glad it's a step forward. It's
right.
good. Look, we're getting rid of a class of weapons, a minor class, no doubt,
right.
Not a major thing in the world's arsenal, but still a step forward, and that someone could take a measure of delight in that and say, that's good. That would be part of a nonviolent spirit in my mind.
You're right, and even write Reagan a card and say, I'm delighted to see that, you have accomplished this, and I hope to see many other similar accomplishments.
Yeah, and I mean...
You're right, and I
why
share
are you gritting
that
your
liberal
teeth while you say that?
I was your stereotypical liberal, and it galled me that he had this feather in his cap, after causing so much flack and being such a so intractable in other approaches towards our arms agreements during all the many other years of his administration. I guess a part of me was gloating and thinking, well, all right, go on, hang in there tough, and when you go out, remember, we can say, well, we certainly didn't make any arms progress under your administration, which is exactly the sort of attitude I was talking about earlier.
Yeah, and I mean,
I'm not patting myself on the back.
Which you very honestly were talking about, but that would be the kind of test case,
That's
it seems
right.
to me, and I think we'd all find, you're being very honest about yours, we would all find certain hostilities that in us long term that would keep us from having this sort of non-violent, open heart which looks for harmony and for progress.
I find myself more and more wanting to lean on that French proverb, to understand all is to forgive all. And to try, and I've been working at this, at putting myself in the mindset of those of peace through strengthers, for instance, of those who really are terrified of communism taking over our country, even if it's through Nicaragua, as they see it, and trying to see if I can make adaptations in my own way of thinking that respects those as fears that are honest. They're honest fears, honest concerns in those people, instead of putting a value judgment on them as being ill-willed and deliberately distorting the political reality, etc. We'll see where that goes.
Well, let's look a little bit at our Judeo-Christian tradition on all of this, Pat, because I think it really does present to us a nonviolent spirit and provides encouragement and inspiration to move in that direction. As Christian people, we look to Jesus of Nazareth and we say, here's the man who most had it together, the best that we've produced. He represents the virtues that we would like to have. And we see Jesus certainly adopting a nonviolent stance, at least as portrayed in the Gospels. There was a movement at that time known as the Zealots, and Jesus had zealots within his own company of 12, Simon, at least one of them. And Jesus always refused to join the Zealot party. He didn't think that the way to deal with the Romans, the occupying power, was to take up arms against them. That would have been pragmatically foolish to begin with, but it didn't seem to fit in with his general program of establishing the kingdom, since the kingdom had a whole different sense about it. That it had to do with peace and justice and living in harmony and creating what our Jewish friends call shalom, beautiful word that describes how the kingdom ought to be. And so Jesus seemed to have a different program, a different plan for how we're going to improve the world. And it didn't include armaments, or it didn't include figuring out how to violently overthrow the occupying power. So I think we would start out with the presupposition that Jesus generally portrayed in his own life this nonviolent spirit.
Also spoke about those who taking up the sword, perishing by the sword, spoke of forgiving our enemies. And, I think you pointed this out before. Some of us tend to find it much easier to be benevolent toward all communists in the world than toward many persons in our own country who simply represent a different political stance or political viewpoint. And yet certainly they're equally, the daughters and sons of the same God who calls us to love those we disagree with, not to mention our enemies. Jesus, who gave us the example of forgiving those who destroyed him ultimately.
Do you think that that has current relevance, that notion that we should love our enemies in this context? I mean, we usually think of the enemies as the aliens, the ones far out, the enemies of the country, for example. However, there are enemies within our midst, and maybe that begins to refer to those who are at the other end of the political spectrum, or people who have different views than we have about how the economy ought to be run, or how we're going to make social progress. And part of that nonviolent spirit maybe would be to figure out how to draw them in, and to figure out how to be a reconciling person when you've got all of these conflicts. As you suggested, it's easy to talk about that in the abstract and to say, yes, I love people, or I'm nonviolent generally. It seems like the difficulty comes in the real-life situations when we are in the harsh, complex circumstances, when the means to achieve good ends are not terribly clear, where we even get conflicts over the ends or purposes themselves. All of this gets messy. It gets abrasive, and then it seems as though we are really tested in terms of any sort of nonviolent spirit.
Struck me just now, Jim, when you were talking, that I don't tend to think of people whose politics are 180 degrees different from my own as my enemies. I don't put that word on them, and it's helpful to even put that word on in a way that challenges me more, I suppose, to look at the gospel call to love my enemies, and perhaps it's the most honest thing to do, to say, well, ideologically, yes, we are enemies. Although
Yeah.
This is
The
funny. I
word
don't
doesn't
like
work.
to think. It doesn't.
Yeah.
I don't like to think of myself.
Right.
As having
Yeah, and
understood
I don't know. I sense the same tension that you were going through as you were trying to analyze that. What flashed in my mind was Jackie Kennedy saying to her husband when he was president that he had these violently different views from a particularly conservative senator, and she saw them swimming together, I guess, in the pool and laughing and so on. And she was saying, well, you know, how can you do that? And yet for him it wasn't even a problem. I mean, the man was 180 degrees away from him ideologically, as you suggested before, but somehow there was some other bonding that transcended that. And who knows exactly what that was, but one would, I guess, look for those common bonds that would bring us closer together, so that we don't have to think of the other as the enemy.
That's right.
And that is really so hard to do, especially when there's a conflict of interest, especially when people's security feels threatened and so on. Then that becomes easy to talk about, but most hard to work out in practice. Some reason all these images are coming to my mind, but it was Martin Luther King after the firebombing of his house that said that no one will make me be violent. No one will pull me down to that sort of level. I won't let them. There's a strength about that. There's a courage of conviction about all of that I find extremely attractive. I won't let myself play that sort of game. I will maintain a higher standard than that.
Right. I won't even, from one perspective, give those people the kind of power over me that will determine my behavior and my attitudes, that I am going to be free and somehow stay above that. I will not be a reactive person. I will direct my own attitudes, my own actions from a higher motive and an internal motive, and not simply allow those persons to, in a sense, control me.
Well, that strikes me as really important to this nonviolent spirit. I won't be a reactive person. If we are simply always reacting, then we really can get drawn into the ordinary violence that really obtains in the world generally. I mean, we live in a violent society, and even the way things are portrayed on TV are not often solved through civil discourse, but through some sort of violent actions. And we become sort of used to that kind of thing. So maybe one of the keys to having a nonviolent spirit is not to be a reactive person. We can go back to Jesus again. He had a positive program, which was to establish the kingdom. It wasn't just to fend people off or to avoid being violent. It all had some higher purpose, and there was a more positive thing. And that, I get back to Gandhi with his satyagraha notion, which means truth force, truth power. That there is in this nonviolence really is a way of drawing in people and creating community and making things work more harmoniously. So I'm back to this active side and initiative side. I like that point you made very much, that the nonviolent spirited person would not be reactive, because if you're always reactive, you're going to get drawn into the circle of violence or hatred. Let's rise above that. Maybe that becomes part of it.
That's helpful, Jim. I'm thinking, too, of the attractiveness of the person who sets out for a cause and is doing something in a positive way. How there's something almost magnetic about that kind of person who somehow keeps his or her disposition very positive, who has a cause that is clearly attractive, that is in sync with one's own value system, and how people will tend to cluster around those sorts of personalities.
Yeah, and then you begin to find your ways to make the progress. A nonviolent spirit is supposed to eventually have some repercussions in the political and social order. The nonviolent spirit, while it is good in itself, today we often link it with persuasion, with an attempt to raise consciousness, to get laws changed, to help create a more just society. Of course, we've seen exemplified in the modern world what you're talking about. I mean, Mohandas Gandhi, out of the nonviolent spirit, was able to gather numerous followers and to create a whole movement and accomplish important political ends. Martin Luther King, another apostle of nonviolence, seemed to be able to do that. Dorothy Day and the whole establishment of the Catholic worker movement. So your point, I think, has been borne out in practice in the modern world. These people, because of their deep spirit, do attract others, and a movement at least sometimes follows from that. Pat, I was thinking of a whole other area we haven't touched here, and that is the importance of prayer in all of this. You know, you were talking, how are you going to be this nonviolent spirit and keep yourself together and so on, and it strikes me that prayer is important in that. You want to comment on that at all?
Who was it? Well, I guess it's from the book of Ecclesiasticus, isn't it? The person who, with violence, how does that go? With violence is the world made violent, for no man. No, with
I'm not going to be able to help you, sorry.
Desolation is the world made desolate, because no man thinketh in his heart. Well, we can get rid of the sexist language, but it comes home to me that in our very busy world, prayer becomes more and more and more important, just to center oneself and to look again at the gospel of the God we claim to follow, and to constantly be, monitoring our heart in terms of the beat of the gospel and the values of Jesus Christ. And quiet time, for me, time with nature is always very helpful and soothing, and helps pull me down and helps me get a new perspective on where it is that in my own life I am not in sync with the Spirit and the Word of the Gospel.
We could look at Jesus as the example, as Jesus goes off by himself and prays, recollects himself, and one imagines that was part of his strength to be in tune with the Father that he called Abba, and enabled him to deal in the nonviolent way with other people, to retain that sort of positive openness to others. He remains, our example in all of this. The par excellence example of the nonviolent spirit. Well, Pat, we've been talking about nonviolence. I began by saying you could think of it as a tactic, and certainly it's been an effective tactic in the modern world, but also we've been looking at it as a spiritual attitude, one in which one is able to be forgiving of other people, one learns how to deal effectively with one's own angers, and perhaps, most importantly, one retains a reflective spirit, a prayerful spirit, in which we find that the God of peace really is the one at work in our hearts.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Sister Pat Schnapp, Associate Professor of English Literature at Siena Heights College. The topic of this week's Reflections was Civil Disobedience, Cultivating a Non-Violent Spirit. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Minister, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.